Hello. We begin today with a solemn acknowledgement of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, UCLA, the Law School, and Critical Race Studies pay respect to the ancestors, Honuk Vetam, to the elders, Ahi Hiram, and to their relatives, Iyo Hin Kem, past, present, and emerging. My name is Laura Gomez, and as Faculty Director of CRS at UCLA Law, I am honored to welcome you to our second webinar on anti-racism in the current season, Dismantling Racism, Critical Race Studies in Action. Our first webinar in this series, What Critical Race Studies Teaches Us About Racism, Resistance, and Policing, featured CRS faculty members and drew an audience of more than 2,000 people. Today, we feature 4 of our 900 alumni, those who have graduated from UCLA Law in the past 2 decades, the time that the Critical Race Studies program has offered a specialization in the JD curriculum. I have one more task, one that's especially joyful. On the day in which we celebrated the life and legacy of Congressman John Lewis, I am honored to introduce CRS Director Jazlene Coley, who will be moderating today's webinar. Jasleen is someone we can always count on for her good trouble making. Jasleen began her troublemaking as a Harvard Law School student 20 years ago, when among other activities, she made a powerful film that critiqued legal education as disconnected from people's suffering and too often from justice. After graduating, she worked on behalf of Justice for Workers at the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, LANE, and at Unite Here Local 11, the Hotel and Food Service Workers Union. Jasleen continued to pursue good trouble when she joined us at CRS 8 years ago, recruiting students, mentoring them, and always advocating for students with other law school administrators, so that those students, in turn, can go out to make their own good trouble. Please join me in welcoming Jazlene Coley.
Laura, thank you so much for that very, very lovely introduction. Although you did not need to mention that my law school experience was 20 years ago, but other than that, that was very lovely. So it has been my honor to direct the Critical Race Studies program for the past 8.5 years now, even though this past half year has felt much, much longer than that. But honestly, it really is such a privilege to be amongst a community of such brilliant, thoughtful, committed, passionate advocates and activists, such as those that we have on our panel today, as well as the many of you who are in our audience. So right now we have over 300 attendees, including some of our alumni, our current students, and our faculty, as well as other fellow travelers in the fields of racial and social justice, as well as some of you who might be new to our program and seeking to learn more. And so we really are so thrilled that you're joining us for these important conversations. You'll note that there is a Q&A function enabled, and we encourage you to ask your questions there. While we really will try to answer as many as we can, we know that given the time limitations and the large number of you, we unfortunately will not be able to get through all of them. But we do promise to follow up with an email that will include additional readings and resources, as well as a recording of this panel. For those of you who joined us last time, you'll know that our Critical Race Studies program at UCLA is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. We were founded in 2000 as a space in which to examine the myriad ways in which systems of racialized oppression are embedded in our legal system, to analyze the way the law both creates and perpetuates racial oppression and hierarchies, and to also learn how to begin to dismantle those same hierarchies and systems of oppression. And Laura Gomez, who began our webinar, was instrumental in the founding of the program, along with some of the panelists from our last webinar, including Cheryl Harris and Devin Carbato, as well as others like Kimberly Crenshaw and Jerry Kong, And of course, there are countless more, including students and alumni who played critical roles, but who unfortunately I don't have time to name. But as the saying goes, it takes a village to challenge traditional legal education discourse and institutionalize a program founded on challenging the systems of racism, white supremacy, on which our very country and our entire legal system were founded. But I digress. So today, I want to focus on the central project of the Critical Race Studies program, transforming racial justice advocacy. When we think of the work that we do, from our curriculum to our conferences, to our clinics, to our other programming, it's all with an eye towards how to train the next generation of racial justice advocates and scholars with the tools, skills, and resources they need to tackle the many challenges we're facing today. And after training now nearly 1,000 alumni over the past 20 years, I'm so excited to have 4 of them with us here today. Although there are so many amazing alumni, these 4 really do exemplify the thoughtful, innovative thinking that we've seen amongst many in our community. So these alums have practiced in the areas of civil rights, public health, criminal justice reform, community organizing, and housing law, amongst others. They have worked in public interest organizations, in corporate law firms, in the legal academy, and in nonprofits that they themselves have founded. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists themselves. Please note that their complete biographies will be included in the materials we will send you tomorrow. So I'll start in alphabetical order. So first with Kristin Johnson. Kristen is currently assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she litigates in all of Ldf's practice areas. Currently, among other cases, Kristen represents 4 Black and Latina girls in middle school who were illegally strip searched by school officials in Binghamton, New York. She is lead counsel in Ldf's Freedom of Information Act litigation against the Department of Justice for failure to disclose records related to DOJ's assessment of the North Charleston Police Department after an NCPD officer murdered Walter Scott. She graduated from UCLA Law in 2013 with specializations in critical race studies and public interest law and policy. And while at UCLA Law, she served as editor-in-chief of UCLA Law Review, where she was actually the first Black student to do so in UCLA Law's history. We also have Priscilla, who is not here yet, but she will be joining us in a little while because she is actually in the middle of a meeting in one of her many roles. This one is in a role as a member of the newly established Los Angeles Sheriff's Oversight Commission. She is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where her teaching and research explore the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. Priscilla has applied her work to broader advocacy efforts as she has served as a trainer for federal public defenders, assisted with the development of new programs in domestic violence centers in South Los Angeles, and strategized with community groups regarding efforts to monitor conditions of confinement in the Los Angeles County Women's Jail. Prior to joining Loyola, Priscilla was a critical race studies teaching fellow here at UCLA from 2010 to 2012, where she taught critical race theory and a seminar on race, gender, and incarceration. She graduated from UCLA Law in 2007. Next, we have Kelly Orians. So Kelly is the co-director of the First 72 Plus, a holistic reentry services organization in New Orleans, Louisiana. Kelly is a 2015 graduate of UCLA School of Law, where she actually had 3 different specializations: critical race studies, public interest law and policy, and business law and policy. She is licensed in Louisiana and named a leader in law by New Orleans City Business. In 2015, she was awarded an Echoing Green Fellowship to help her launch the First 72 Plus. And in 2018, she was awarded a Michael Rubinger Community Fellowship Award by the Local Initiative Support Corporation to develop best practices for reentry legal services in Louisiana. And finally, we have Jason Wu, who is a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society in New York City, where he practices in the Housing Justice Unit's Group Advocacy Project. He represents low-income communities of color to preserve and expand affordable housing, build collective tenant power, and enforce tenants' rights. He is currently a trustee of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, UAW Local 2325, which is the nation's oldest union of 2,000 attorneys and legal workers across New York. He has written op-eds on educational equity, housing policy, policing, race in America, and social movements. Jason graduated from UCLA School of Law with a specialization in CRS in 2010. So thank you again, all of you, for being here with us today. So let me start with my first question. So as you know, critical race theory teaches us the power of narrative, of what stories get to be told, what gets emphasized, and what remains unsaid. And each year, as I meet with incoming law students, I'm so incredibly moved by their stories of what has brought them here to legal institutions that weren't necessarily designed for them or for what they want to learn, and really seeing how they grapple with learning and critiquing a legal system that's oppressed and harmed their communities. So I'd love to begin with some of your own personal narrative. Could each of you tell us a little bit about what brought you to law school and a little bit about what it is you do today? So I'm going to start in reverse chronological order in terms of years of graduation. So I will start with Kelly, our 2015 graduate.
Thanks so much, Jasleen, and thanks for having me today. Kristen was actually the editor-in-chief of the Law Review during my first year, and so I don't think I ever envisioned that I'd be speaking on a panel with her after graduation. So it's very exciting to be here today with everyone, and thanks for having me. So I actually came to UCLA from New Orleans. I'd graduated from college about 5 years before I started law school, and I was working as a campaign coordinator for the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, and my job was to end the practice of sentencing juveniles to life without the possibility of parole. And the project was grounded in a grassroots organization called Citizens for Second Chances, which was an organization comprised of over 360 juvenile lifers, as well as hundreds of their friends and family members. And I pursued this job in large part out of a desire to get closer to families who, like my own, had a loved one who was incarcerated. I had grown up in a 99.7% white community in Castle Rock, Colorado, which is about 20 minutes south of Denver. And I grew up keeping a secret that my family was one of the over 2 million families who had a loved one in prison, and would go on to be one of the 7 million families that have a loved one under some form of community correctional supervision. And I really wanted to get closer to experiences like that because I didn't have an opportunity to really talk about that when I was growing up. But pretty quickly after I was hired in this position, I realized that my family's experience, while definitely scary and challenging, was dramatically different from the average experience of a family member whose loved one is involved in the criminal justice system. And it was through those contrasts, I think, that I really came to learn that the criminal justice system was designed to control and oppress communities of color. And my family, as a white family, just so happened to get caught up within a system that was designed that way. And it was actually really a major victory, and the limitations of that victory that we experienced while I was running Citizens for Second Chances that led me to law school. In 2010, which was a couple years into the job, the case Graham v. Florida and Sullivan v. Florida got cert from the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was the second time since Roper that the court really confronted this issue of sentencing for juveniles. And as happened, we won, and we had a pretty major victory. They're not a full victory, and it created an opportunity for over 66 of the several hundred people serving this sentence in Louisiana to be resentenced. And so I had the real privilege to work on the legal team that helped bring the first few people impacted by this sentence back to court. And on December 3rd, Robert Caston, and Joshua Carter were resentenced to credit for time served after having served 44 years and 46 years respectively in prison. And I just so happened to be the person that had the privilege of picking them up from the gates of the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. And I think I was like 27 or 28 at that time. And I definitely thought to myself on the drive up there that I just need to retire because it can't possibly get any better than this. I definitely don't need to go to law school. Like, I'm already part of this historic thing, and this is all we had been working for. And so I pick Bob up, and we're riding home in my car, and about 30 minutes into the ride, he turned to me and asked, where do I get my heart medicine that I take every single day? And I had absolutely no answer to that. I had truthfully, up until that point, not really thought much about what was going to happen after the fact. And this was something that it was a real turning point. And so I at that point, I had been wavering back and forth between going and getting a master's in social work or going to law school. And it really came down to an issue of access and a law license giving us access. And so cutting to, sort of speeding up the story, I ended up teaming up with a group of formerly incarcerated folks, and they confirmed what we thought I needed was to go to law school so that we could create a reentry program in New Orleans, and I could be the attorney that would get us access to our clients, and we would build that. So one thing I have to pause on for a moment is we were definitely misguided, and I got to give a shout out to Frankie Guzman and Dwayne Betts and other attorneys who survived prison and went on to law school and became licensed attorneys. And it is a myth that, folks that have been caught up in the system cannot pursue law degrees and cannot get law licenses. Frankie was actually my supervisor for my 1L clerkship. But when I ended up at UCLA, I quickly took advantage of the opportunity to take classes outside of the law school and ended up at the Anderson School of Business for 2 semesters, where we wrote, with my partners in Louisiana, wrote the business plan for the first 72 plus that helped us secure our early stage funding. And today, over the last 6 years, the first 72 plus has grown into a reentry transitional housing program with case management, peer support groups, a free legal services clinic, a small business incubator, and a zero interest loan fund. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So next we'll hear from Kristin Johnson.
Great. Can you all hear me? Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really consider it a privilege to be on this panel with my fellow panelists and to be invited to speak as a CRS alum. I want to thank everyone involved in putting this event together, with a special thank you to Jazlene for leading us in this webinar and for her leadership at the law school's Critical Race Studies program. I'm particularly excited that there are prospective and current law students attending this webinar. So bear with me if most of my comments are geared primarily toward that segment of attendees. I just remember this is the type of programming I would cling to as a law student. So again, thank you for this. So I'm not a person who knew they wanted to be a lawyer as a child, and I didn't take a straight path from college to law school. I always knew I wanted to help people, and in retrospect, racial justice was always a core part of the work I wanted to do. So I wanted to be a doctor first, right? That's pretty common among youngsters. But I wanted to be a doctor because I witnessed in my own neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, poor health. And I grew up in a community that was practically 100% Black, right? The population was pretty much 100% Black. And I saw poor health and poor access to health care. So there was a hospital down the street, and actually I live in the neighborhood that I grew up in, even now, and the hospital is still providing not the best health care that our community deserves. But I was gonna be the doctor to take care of all of them. I was gonna take care of every sick person in my neighborhood. And so went to college, did the pre-med thing, stuck with that. And while I was there, I was introduced to the practice of public health. And I was instantly interested because I saw it as a way to help more Black people, right? Public health is about population-based approaches to health problems. And so it was kind of like, I can get even more bang for the advocacy buck, if you will. So then I pursued graduate studies in public health. And that's where I learned about the concept of the social determinants of health, right? These are things outside of the medical model that impact your health. Things like housing, employment, education, and the correlation between racial disparities in those sectors and racial disparities in health. It really resonated with me. I felt like those were the words I couldn't put to what I was seeing in my very own community. And as I started investigating who's fighting those fights in those sectors, it was lawyers. So similar to Kelly, this was about access, right? If I want access to these spaces where decisions are being made, resources are being allocated, and where people will listen, for better or worse, people listen to lawyers, right? So whether it was via policy work or in the courts, I mean, I didn't know where I wanted to be as a lawyer, but I knew it would help to be a lawyer to do the type of work I wanted to do. And I knew I found a pathway that ultimately would give me the tools to make the sort of impact on Black communities that I always desired. So that's what brought me to the profession, brought me to law school and to the profession of specifically of being a lawyer dedicated to racial justice. And to that end, I'm currently an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which I'll call LDF going forward. And I can get into the work we do a little later in the program, but I got to LDF by way of a fellowship called the Freed Frank Fellowship. And that's a partnership, a longstanding partnership at this point that LDF and the law firm of Freed Frank has, where I was able to start at Freed Frank for 2 years as a litigation associate, and they do corporate litigation, and then transition to the Legal Defense Fund. And I bring that up because I think, I didn't go to law school to do big law. I didn't summer at big law at all, so it was like a huge transition for me. But that was, I think, an important time in my transition to be able to do the work that I'm ultimately doing. And again, I know there are current law students on here, and I like to think I'm not that far off from you all. I graduated 2013. But I know there are many different pathways you can take to get to this work. And I was open as I was willing to be and got to where I ultimately wanted to be. And so I think I can leave it at that for now and pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So next we'll hear from Jason Wu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So I am currently a housing attorney at the Legal Aid Society, and the work I do is focused on building tenant power, representing tenant associations, and I view this work within a broader framework of fighting against gentrification. And I very much see this work as being tied to racial justice. So I came into this work about 10 years ago, approximately, and I graduated from law school, moved back to New York, which is where I grew up. I'm a first-generation college student, first-generation attorney in my family, and I knew I wanted to do racial justice work, and I was really open to the different possibilities. There weren't a lot of jobs at the time due to the recession, and I really didn't know if I was going to end up practicing law because of that. So I applied everywhere, and I ended up getting interviewed at the Harlem Community Law Office and for the Tenant Group Representation Project, which blends both a sense of direct legal services, but also organizing in terms of organizing tenants and building tenant power. And so it ended up, I think, being a very good fit. And my supervisor at the time, Magda Rosa Rios, she, gave me that opportunity, and so here I am today. And I came into the legal profession also not necessarily by design. It wasn't something I sought out growing up. It wasn't necessarily a goal of mine. When I went to college, I ended up studying ethnic studies and being exposed to critical race theory. And it was through learning about critical race theory, learning about intersectionality, learning about rebellious lawyering, that I realized there was a space within the law and the legal profession for me to continue doing the work around racial justice that I was doing as a student organizer at the time. And so CRT as a movement and the CRS program created an institutional space for me to do the work that I do today. And it's something that was developed through generations of struggle and prior generations of lawyers and lawyers of color. It includes people like Derek Bell, Mari Matsuda, Jerry Lopez, Kimberly Crenshaw, and many of the other names in terms of the founding faculty members, Shara Harris, Devin Carbato, Laura Gomez, and so many more. And so learning about some of their writings in college showed me that there was a pathway and a career out there where I could blend my interest in doing social justice work with the law. And so I'm really grateful for the CRS program, not only for the academic and scholarship that has come out from CRT, but also the legal community that not only supported me when I was in law school and the network and the classmates that I had, but also that continues to provide that support. And I'm really inspired by the work of my classmates who continue to do really incredible racial justice work. And I continue to be grateful for the Critical Race Studies program. Even convening spaces like this allow for reflection, which oftentimes we aren't able to do when we are just kind of in the trenches doing the work day to day. So I'm really grateful for the CRS program and the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing a little bit about your stories and your backgrounds. So next, I'd like to move to thinking about this current moment as, for lack of a better term, it's a particularly intense moment that we're finding ourselves in. There's a joke that in the future, historians will be asked which part of 2020 they specialize in. So we're finding ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic that's physically and financially devastated communities, particularly communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, resulting in long-term health and economic impacts we can only begin to guess at, but we know that the implications are grim without serious and considerable interventions. And at the same time, we've also, unfortunately and unsurprisingly, seen the continuation of police violence and the killing of Black lives. But somewhat surprisingly, we've also seen the formation of a political uprising and a movement which by many accounts might actually be the largest in US history. And not only has the sheer number of people who have been participating in protests been staggering, but the protests have also been impressive both in their widespread geographic reach and in their continued duration. And as a result of the social uprising, we've seen some real shifts in the ways we're talking about race. And even the most cynical amongst us has dared to wonder if this is a moment that is possibly ripe for real systemic transformative change. So considering this current moment, how does your critical race studies education and/or critical race theory in general impact your thinking around your work in particular and/or lawyering, advocacy, activism in general? So I see Priscilla has actually joined us from our commission meeting. And Priscilla, I don't know if you're ready, if you'd like to jump in and answer first this second question. Maybe you can bring in a little bit about the first question that you missed. All right. In case she is not ready, I think we'll go in. I think that she is having audio difficulties, so we will start with Jason, if you don't mind. So we're going to go in reverse order this time.
Sure, thank you. So CRT informs everything that I do. It's impossible to separate how it's shaped the way that I approach the work, how I understand the issues, and how I see my role as an attorney in relationship to the communities that are directly impacted by systemic racism. And so as someone who does direct legal services work sometimes, and I think historically, legal services is treated like a colorblind practice, that the work that we do is poverty lawyering and that our clients are poor and working class. And to the extent that race is factored into the analysis, it's almost descriptive or as a correlation. So our clients are poor and they just happen to be Black and brown. And obviously, with an understanding of critical race studies, that's not the correct framing of the practice, right? And so for me, as someone who is doing housing, but not fair housing work, not necessarily traditional civil rights work, I do see race embedded into the work that we do. Oh, sorry. And so I think we need to name race, which is part of the work of CRT. how do we bring a race-conscious practice into the work of housing and legal services? And I think that there is power in naming race. There is power in unpacking how something like housing is situated within a broader political and historical context. And so if we can name race, if we can bring race consciousness into the practice, it also helps us to refocus how the law oftentimes limits and narrowly and inaccurately frames the legal problem. And so the legal problems that we see in housing as someone who does direct legal services is not what the media often portrays as individual kind of moral failing, that people are not paying their rent because, you know, they're mismanaging their money, or they're not working hard enough, or whatever the stereotypes are that get kind of overlaid into the housing context. But if we can understand that systemic racism that's embedded into our laws and policy and our history have created an environment that produces racial stratification, then we also have to understand that we need to address the root causes in terms of systemic solutions. And so I think that that ties in with the work of CRS, which is around dismantling systemic racism, moving beyond an individual blaming framework. And that translates into the social movement context around cancel rent and the movement around rent strikes, which kind of reframes how we think about tenants withholding rent as opposed to tenants are failing to pay rent, right? And so I think that that reframing and the race consciousness are all important in shifting how we think about the problem and how we want to approach the solutions. And then the second thing I wanted to touch upon is thinking intersectionally about this work. And so intersectionality helps us to think through intersectionally marginalized communities that are not only experiencing the harm, but also who needs to be part of the solution. And I think that that's obviously really important. What I've also started to see in terms of how intersectionality has been taken up is to think about intersectional solidarity and thinking intersectionally about different social justice movements. And so when we're talking about housing, it's not just about housing in a vacuum, but understanding that when we disinvest in housing to invest in policing and criminalization, that those things are tied together. When we think about housing justice, we also have to understand that criminalization and policing is actually taking away from public safety in the home. And that's something that Priscilla Ocen has written about in her work around criminalization of Black. Any linkages that can be made across areas of law and social movements. And I think that when we have the systemic holistic approach, that's where we can get at the possibility of dismantling systemic racism. Because too often we're told, or we do this work in different corners, and we do work in isolation as if if we tweak one area of injustice, that somehow will fix the problem. And these things are all connected. And so the last thing I just want to touch on is that a lot of the work that I do is also outside of my job as an attorney. Some of it is in the work that I do on my local community board around budget justice and how we frame the demands around divesting from policing and investing in communities through education, housing, and healthcare. It shows up in the community organizing that I do and the political education that I do. So when we're talking about know your rights or doing trainings for the community, it's more than just this is what the law says, but also unpacking how the law structures inequality in our society. And then I also just want to mention some of the work I've done in terms of writing. And part of why I started doing that is because we have to shift the narrative in the media. We have to shift the narrative, whether it's through social media campaigns like the one that I partner with our Black Attorneys of Legal Aid in organizing called Cops Lie, because we need to shift how we think about what's the problem, who's the problem, and how we approach the problem.
Thank you so much, Jason. Next, we'll hear from Kristen.
Sorry, just having a slight technical difficulty, but all will be well. So I'm a litigator at Ldf, and just like Jason, critical race theory is such a core part of what I do. Just to backtrack a little bit more about what Ldf does. Ldf was founded in 1940 under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, who, as we all know, subsequently became the first Black U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Ldf has 4 substantive practice areas: political participation, education, criminal justice, and economic justice. And in all of those practice areas, Ldf advocates on behalf of Black communities across the country, specifically bringing racial justice claims. Though most of our work historically and even now is in the South. And so our work runs the gamut from litigation to policy, organizing, public education, et cetera. And, you know, Ldf began at a time when this promise of equality and due process of law could not be met, right? Because of state-sponsored racial inequality. And I say that because we're still in that place. As intense as this moment is, the problems of this moment aren't wholly new, right? If you were to say the phrase state-sanctioned or state-sponsored racial inequality without giving any historical context, I think many people in the public in this moment would think about the moment we're in right now. That's with respect to police violence, how states have been responding or not responding to COVID-19, even though there are glaring racial disparities there. That's state-sponsored racial inequality. More people are paying attention now, and more people are getting engaged, but the problems at their core aren't new. So in this moment, at an institution like Ldf, again, the core of the substance of our work isn't particularly new. We've been fighting against anti-Black racism specifically for decades, but the work has intensified, kind of as Jasleen alluded to earlier on. So when I think about the CRT tenets that inform my work in this not new but intense moment, right? I think of the ways the tenets manifest while doing the work and how important it is to frame many of the issues we work on in this way. As you know, as Jason put it, like naming race and racism as the problem it is. And so similarly, I think of, again, bad systems, not bad apples, right? We think of the title of this program even is Dismantling Racism, not Dismantling Racists, right? A well-oiled system is gonna work the way it's designed to work. So when we have a system in which there's every incentive to kind of promote and perpetuate white supremacy and anti-Black racism, that's what we're gonna get. And there are many ways that as a litigator, litigating racial justice claims, I see this manifest in our work. And so I'll just give a couple of examples. So I think with everything that's going on over the last several decades, we've seen our government or governmental institutions diversify at some of the highest levels, right? We're seeing more people of color higher up in the ranks of various jurisdictions. And so for us in our work, that may mean Black leadership in a school district that's still subject to a desegregation order from the 50s or 60s, but where there's still significant and glaring racial disparities when it comes to the education of Black students, right? And so in the course of working these cases, we're fighting on behalf of Black students. What you'll find at times is these school districts will flaunt Black leadership to show there's no racism here, there can't be racism here. They won't say they're anti-racist, but we don't discriminate, right? And for some judges in the cases that we appear before, that argument has real currency, right? And I think that even the general public, that argument for a long time has had a lot of currency. I mean, we even had situations where the mention of the election of President Obama, particularly in the voting rights context, right? Like, look, this country elected the first Black president. no racism here. And so we see that manifest in our education docket. We also see that in the policing context, right? Again, we're in this moment of increased scrutiny of police departments. People are paying attention, people are engaged. And we're also in a moment where there are, you know, more Black police chiefs than there have been, right, decades ago. But again, bad systems are going to give you bad results. And I think that's a core piece of what, of the language and the concept and the tools that CRS gave me and how I think about how I do my work. And racist systems give you racist results. And so that, the thing is, that's not always going to be an argument that will get you the win in court, right? That's a hard argument to make, not just in the face of there being Black leadership in positions, and that's not knocking Black leadership. It is what it is. A bad system is what it is, right? No matter what your intentions are when you go into a bad system, the system's tainted, right? Again, not always a winning argument in court, not always a winning argument in the court of public opinion, but it is the lived reality of the very people we are advocating for. And so, you know, I think it's really critical that as practitioners of critical race theory, right, critical race studies and action, that's an argument I think we probably all are constantly making. This is about systems. And it forces actually all of us and the people we advocate before to ask the hard questions, right? It's easier to say there are a bunch of bad apples. It's easier to say, well, it's just that school superintendent, we'll just replace them. Oh, it's just that mayor, it's just that, no. The system's bad, the system's rotten, you're gonna get rotten results. And so we're building on the work that has come before us and doing the work in a way that meets the moment, but the argument is the same. I would argue this is the same argument that's been at the core of racial justice work before we had fancy labels to put on it, right? And I think if we're not attacking the systems, we're not actually gonna get the racially just solutions we all want to see. And that kind of CRS tenet has been mission critical to the work that I do as a civil rights litigator.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So next we'll hear from Kelly.
So yeah, I was thinking a lot about like the incredible optimism that my team and I at the First 72 Plus started to have within about the first month of the shutdown. That although you know that certain things really started to feel possible, and that although there weren't necessarily new, there did feel like there were some new openings. And at some point, it felt like we've realized more progress and change over the last 4 months for issues we'd been fighting for than we had over the last 6 years since we started. For instance, we're seeing historically much lower bonds and a historically lower population within our parish prison, which is equivalent to a county jail anywhere else. Although that being said, we've also learned that there is absolutely a tolerance for people dying in custody, even people who shouldn't be there. And I think our state is not is not a very good example at all of what the potential could have been for releasing folks from their departments of corrections. Other states have done better, although I don't think we can point to any state that's really done anything truly revolutionary in that way. But we've seen the relaxing of certain probation and parole requirements. On the philanthropic front, we've seen a loosening of restrictions to allow us to provide direct financial assistance to our clients. We were able to raise and disperse over $250,000 over the last 4 months just to go directly to clients that we've been working with for the last several years. We've seen some landlords relaxing their restrictions on felony convictions and credit as barriers to tenancy. We even, our Department of Corrections overnight and with no notice changed its language from saying inmates and convicts to people in prison. They even changed a button on their website from saying inmate locator to incarcerated person locator. The group Voice of the Experienced, a group of currently and formerly incarcerated folks, had been fighting this battle for over a decade, and then sort of overnight it happened. And really just in some cases, more compassion overall. And that's been really interesting and set a stage for, I think, some very powerful moves. But for me, I think as one of the most profound lessons from CRT, and I had Professor Harris as my professor for my intro classes was really about the dangers and the consequences of seemingly liberal reforms. You know, like as Angela Davis has talked about extensively, you know, it's at one point, you know, prisons were considered the progressive alternative to a more archaic and more punitive system. The criminalization of domestic violence was, although mostly to white feminists, seemed like progress for women's rights. Drug court and diversion programs, to some still, are a progressive alternative to incarceration. And when I was working to end the practice of juvenile life without parole, we were saying over and over and over, just let folks, you know, live the rest of their lives under supervision. And now, you know, 12 years later, I have clients who, when I wrote my law review comment titled, I'll say I'm home, I won't say I'm free, which was a quote of a client of mine who got out after 28 years in prison to lifetime parole and has faced some incredible restrictions. And I have clients who are choosing to spend more years in prison to continue to fight so that they don't have to spend so many years under supervision. And I think it's thinking about cautioning as we promote reforms, like Kristen is saying, these are systems that even with the most progressive of leaders, we're not going to truly dismantle racism, and we're not going to end systemic racism. And so thinking about the cautionary tales as we are dismantling the systems and what they're putting in place, that if we continue to keep incarceration and policing and the courts at the center of what we do, even if we invite more public health professionals into the courtroom, and even if we like refer people out to mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment, when police and the courts are still central to people's lives, we're not really going to see a huge difference, and we're not really going to dismantle these systems. And this is within the first 72 plus, especially, we function sometimes, although I try to resist it, is we're classified as an alternative to incarceration. And also as a nonprofit organization, when we think about deliverables to our funders, a reduction in recidivism is one of the things that we're judged by, which is a really unfair task to put on an NGO when we cannot control and protect nearly as much as we would like our clients from the systems that control them. And so, and for instance, I also think a lot within the CRT framework about how racism shows up in an incredibly ordinary and mundane way that is really not, you know, sexy. It's my biggest battle actually on a daily basis, and as a lawyer since I graduated, has been against the Office of Motor Vehicles. And I certainly didn't think when I came to law school that I would be, you know, that my villain would be the DMV, you know, or traffic courts. And I've come to realize that not only has the Stanford Open Policing Project has proved what any person of color that's been driving has already known, that Black drivers are more likely to be stopped, ticketed, searched, and arrested than white drivers, and the collateral consequences of that and the control that's placed on my clients' lives is just extraordinary. And so when we first have someone that comes into our program, one of the first things that we screen for are attachments, which are misdemeanor warrants for their arrest for missing traffic court, because they'll leave prison after several decades with these traffic tickets still hanging over them. And not only can they be arrested at any moment, but in order to even get their driver's license reinstated, which is a crucial requirement for employment, they need to pay sometimes upwards of $10,000 in debt owed between the traffic courts and the Office of Motor Vehicles. And they have to appear in traffic courts multiple times in order to fight this battle. And I bring that up just because of the layers that it produces of barriers towards folks being able to access employment, and then in turn being able to access housing. because of the money that is paramount to be able to access housing. And if we're not paying attention to these seemingly very ordinary and kind of boring aspects of racial oppression, we're just focused on the ultimate outcome, which for our folks would be homelessness, unemployment, and reincarceration. We're missing where the stem from that is. And so in the alternative to that, and we're going to touch on this in the last question, but in the alternative to that, we have to, like Kristen's saying, we have to think about entirely new systems, not just more compassionate people in already existing systems.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And next we'll hear from Priscilla. I'm sorry, Priscilla, I think we're still having trouble hearing you.
No.
No. Okay, okay, sorry about that. I'll work out, we'll work something out for Priscilla. And, but in the meantime, I will move on to my last question before I open it up to some of the audience questions. So my last question for you is about looking forward and next steps. Robin D.G. Kelly, a professor of history and African American studies here at UCLA, as well as a CRS affiliated faculty member, writes in the preface to his book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, "Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us." So I'm curious to hear what your new visions are, as well as how can we create the structures and resources in place that allow for us the space to both begin to imagine and then to build these visions. What steps can legal actors and legal institutions, including legal education, take to support processes that can and must transform us? How do we better support social movements and communities impacted? And are there areas of critical race theory that should be further developed and are new directions you would like to see the field explore? And you should feel free to focus on just one facet of the question, as I know this can go in many directions. So I'm mixing up the order a little bit. So I'm going to start with Kristen, and then Kelly, then Priscilla, and then Jason. So Kristen, if you're ready.
Yes, great. So I think when thinking about how we can better support social movements and communities, and this, the concept of revolution as process, looking to legal education, I think one thing we can do a better job of is training future racial justice lawyers on the importance of listening to community. That may sound really basic, but I think that's still a core piece of doing this work with integrity and actually seeing real sustainable change. And that's not just listening in crisis times, but it's before the crisis becomes mainstream. So again, a lot of people are paying attention to longstanding problems now. A lot of people are getting engaged, but there have been people who've been doing this work who haven't been in the mainstream, and probably that's part of the reason why they've been successful in even getting us to this point. This is not, this sort of uprising doesn't kind of happen out of nowhere. Yes, it was triggered by a series of events, but there was a buildup to work being done on the ground so that when the time came, a time such as this, we would see what we're seeing, right? And so I think, yes, critical race studies provides us with the tools or lens through which to kind of understand what we're seeing happening and the racial inequities rather. And we talk about race, power, and the law. And the reality is our profession as lawyers, for better or worse, it's a powerful one. And it can be very easy to think, particularly as a new lawyer, right? In law school, we come with all creative ways to think about things, and you go out in the world getting ready to practice, and it's critical that you listen to communities. And it's not about being humble because it's the right thing to do, but it's really about centering the people in the work, because you'll actually get the results that the community wants. And so in my experience at LDF, for the cases that I've been on, and again, a lot of our work is in the South, right? And our main office is in New York. So when we're traveling, you know, before we even think about filing cases and we're investigating things, we're in community, spending days, weeks at a time. And it's not about finding plaintiffs, right? We need to really know what the community wants. We may all agree on a problem, but the solution is really where you will see even variation within the community, right? And if we're gonna properly represent the interests of these communities, we need to get a handle on what the community actually thinks about this, what the community wants. Because ultimately the community has to live with the solutions that are being advocated for, right? And so again, when we think about power, I think it's something that law schools and public interest legal organizations need to do a better job of training future lawyers to really digest this practice of community being in the driver's seat in this fight. Because what we don't want to do is perpetuate the very power dynamics that plague the systems that we're aiming to transform. So I just think that's something, again, it's not that I didn't hear that in law school, but it's such a real part of what I experience every day doing the type of work that I do. And so I just wanted to share that, particularly for the law students and prospective law students on the call. One more thing I'll add is in this moment, much like the folks who came before us doing racial justice work, we can get creative in our advocacy. And I say that because in some ways we've come to rely heavily, so heavily on statutes that can be undermined by a change in administration or a change in the makeup of Congress, or a really bad Supreme Court decision, right? And so when I get discouraged by what I see, such as like the Shelby County decision and what it did to the Voting Rights Act, right? Or the rescinding of the furthering fair housing rules, I'm reminded that when folks like Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, and their contemporaries were litigating in the 40s, 50s, they didn't have the Voting Rights Act. They didn't have the Fair Housing Act. They didn't have various civil rights acts that we've become tied to. And that's not to knock these tools and say they're not worth fighting for. Indeed, they're worth fighting for, but we can reimagine what advocacy looks like, right? We still have the 14th Amendment. And I know that one of the projects that LDF has been working on, and something that we talk about a lot and think about, is how can we rethink or retool this fervor with which kind of the American public itself talks or thinks about the 14th Amendment, or rather the lack of fervor, right? So the idea that we talk about and think about the First and Second Amendment with so much passion, just generally in the public, right? And it's something that every American has a right to. But somehow the 14th Amendment doesn't get that same sort of shine. And that's for various reasons. We probably know most of them, those of us on this call. But just because it is that way doesn't mean it has to be that way. And so I think in thinking about a new vision for the future, it's reimagining the tools that we have at the ready going forward. I think there's much room for creativity with the tools that we rely on to move things forward.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Next, we'll move on to Kelly.
So immediately after law school, I actually didn't identify as an attorney right away. I think I was best categorized as a social entrepreneur because I was helping to build the first 72 plus. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about the role of public interest organizations, whether nonprofit or for-profit, within this space and within social change movements. And I think one of the things that I would love to see explored more deeply within law schools and within CRT is the ways in which white supremacy and systemic racism are perpetuated by public interest institutions, and particularly nonprofits. And I see it occur on multiple levels in regards to funding and leadership, and then also in regards to operations of programs, especially within direct services. And so I wanted to, and I was startled a couple of years ago when I really started looking into this, at thinking about just the big business that especially nonprofits are, that several $1 trillion in assets are controlled by the 501c3 sector. And in 2018, over $400 billion were donated to 501c3s. That money and all of that power and resources are controlled by a predominantly white group of folks. Only 16% of nonprofit board members are people of color, 90% of board chairs are white, 90% of executive directors are white, 27% of nonprofit boards are 100% white. And when you look at organizations that are led by people of color, they don't get nearly as much access to resources as white-led organizations. And when they are given access to resources, you actually see an incredible amount of strings attached to it. I believe Echoing Green, although it might have come before Echoing Green, started referring to this as philanthropic redlining. And recently they found Echoing Green, which was the first funder of the first 72 plus. I was an Echoing Green fellow after I graduated. When they surveyed 164 social enterprises, they found that white organizations that were led by predominantly white folks had budgets that were 24% larger than those led by people of color, and that groups led by Black women received less money than those led by Black men or white women. So I think we see, you know, and often I think that public interest organizations get sort of a pass because of their charitable mission, and that we don't put enough attention to what's occurring in those spaces. And so when especially for us as an organization, like my presence and longevity within the organization speaks to that issue and that problem. And I share power with an executive director. His name is Ben Smith, and he's formerly incarcerated. He's a Black man who spent 20 years in prison. And we talk a lot about the parity within our relationship, because we also have to acknowledge the very real difference in the opportunities that both of us had. And that we have to, and the social capital, not just the financial capital, but the social capital that I came into the organization with, and the real intentional effort we have to put to dismantling that and sharing that power and increasing opportunities. And so also then on the direct services front, as Kristen's talking about, like we tend to, if you hadn't had the opportunity to reimagine a system that is not dependent and built around violence, state-sponsored violence and policing and incarceration, if you haven't had an opportunity to learn about alternatives to what that is, what are you reimagining? You're just going to rebuild those same institutions. And at the beginning of quarantine, the first 72 plus, we just created this sort of radical idea that we just wanted to house as many people as we possibly could. We originally were housing 6 people at a time, and we knew that was not nearly enough. And so we started raising hundreds of thousands of dollars and rented. We're currently on Airbnb. I have, I think, 14 reservations for private homes across the city, and we have 50 hotel rooms that are booked at an extended stay. What that resulted in is us taking responsibility for people, for, you know, dozens of people and children, their health and wellness, and forced us to confront issues around how do we make sure resources are available, but then also how do we define what rules should exist? How do we define accountability and how to hold people accountable? And how do we reimagine that system? Fortunately, before this all started, we had come to a determination as a team that in order, like I said, to reimagine these systems, we need to know what other opportunities are available. And so we started doing trainings on the clock with my coworkers around trauma-informed care, harm reduction, around adult mental health first aid, around the tenets of critical race theory, to really give us a framework within which we could think about deconstructing the systems that we're criticizing and rebuild those systems. And one thing that I want to point out, and this is at the forefront of everything that we do, is time. One of the ways that, as you surveyed my coworkers, and who are all formerly incarcerated, with the exception of myself, we started looking at the incredible amount of time that we take from people who are living in poverty. You show up to court and you'll sit for hours and if the judge is late, but if you're 5 minutes late, you'll get fined and get remanded. And I once counted the number of agencies and organizations and appointments that a formerly incarcerated person has to meet within a few days of being released. And I stopped counting at 11 because it was just getting absolutely ridiculous. And we take up so much of people's time, and people who are living in poverty are dependent upon systems that don't value their time. And so as a direct services organizations, one of the guiding principles of what we try to do is to not take our clients' time for granted, because I think that's a really nefarious way that white supremacy and that these power dynamics pop up in a really nefarious way for indirect services, and it doesn't get enough tension to talk about just how unbelievably time consuming it is to live in poverty.
Thank you so much. And next, we'll hear from Priscilla.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear me? I'm on the call. You can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
Good. Woo. All right. First I want to thank Jasleen and the Critical Race Studies program for creating this space, and for you, Jason, Kristen, and Kelly for being in conversation. One of the first things I've learned, and I'm going to answer sort of 3 questions since I'm reclaiming my time. So the first will be sort of what did I learn from critical race theory? The first is that technology is racist and is a hater in many instances and will try to block you from speaking. That's number one. Number 2 is that law is a product of racial power, period. It produces it, it reinforces it, it perpetuates it. That historical context matters, right? We often answer legal questions in a vacuum, or we're asked to. But when we think about the origins of property, of settler colonialism, of enslavement, of capitalism, of policing, then we can better understand our current predicament and the intractability, seeming intractability of many of these problems. That law is not neutral. It is a player in facilitating exclusion and domination and subordination. That law constructs and polices the boundaries of these seemingly, again, neutral and natural categories: man, woman, white, black, Asian, Latinx. Right? These are all categories that have been created by law, and those boundaries are policed. Often quite violently, as we have seen time and time again, and as these uprisings are helping us to understand. That whiteness and white supremacy is the bedrock of our constitutional order. And I think that when we understand those things, we also then understand the limits of law and how law is not a solution to these seemingly intractable problems of settler colonialism, white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and so forth, because it is a player, because it constructs these things. And so I really want to lift up the things that Jason and Kristen and Kelly were saying about, questioning legal reforms, questioning liberal reforms, because of the way in which law is a active and political player in constructing inequality. So that's what I've learned. But another big thing that I've learned is that movements matter, that agitation and resistance matters, and that transformation and change is possible. I remember having a conversation with Professor Harris when I was a deeply despondent 1 or 2L, and she reminded us about the 60 to 70 year gap between Plessy and Brown. And she reminded us not to lose hope, that our agitation, that our resistance, that our standing up for ourselves, that our voicing in the face of agencies and systems that would try to silence us, imbued us with a sense of humanity and dignity that they couldn't take away. And so the other question I want to answer is sort of how does it show up in my work? So it shows up in my writing and teaching. I write about, I use a theoretical framework and methodologies of intersectionality and other insights of critical race theory as I write about systems of policing. And because of those insights, I understand that policing isn't just limited to law enforcement. It's not limited to sheriffs and police departments or district attorneys. It's also our schools. It's our social welfare agencies. It's the DMV. It is it's everywhere, right? That we use a punitive and disciplinary lens as a mechanism of social control. And so if we look at policing in that way, then it helps us to look more holistically at systems of domination. It shows up in the way that I go about my work using this intersectional lens, right? That we need to center the voices of communities and people who are the most marginalized by these systems, right? And that the people who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. So that means for me centering the experiences and voices of Black women and girls and women and girls of color in the work that I do to help us to understand how not only racialized our carceral state is, but how gender and sexuality are essential to how these systems operate and their logics of operation. It shows up in the work that I do with in LA County and elsewhere with amazing organizers, because working with and reading about the work of folks like Kim Crenshaw and Jerry Lopez helps us understand the symbiotic nature of law and social movements, and helping us to fashion meaningful and transformational solutions to problems. So, part of the reason why I was late to the panel is that I was on a Zoom call with the LA County Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission, where we were debating issues related to use of force and whether the Sheriff's Department ought to be able to continue to use the carotid restraint that took the life of George Floyd. And of course, the Sheriff's Department was arguing in favor of keeping it, arguing that legal rules could restrain lethal violence. And again, that idea that law can restrain police violence is antithetical to what we know about law and how it authorizes police violence. And so when you think about it that way, calls to defund law enforcement, abolish the police and prisons makes sense. It makes sense when you look at the history of legal reforms and how they failed to control the unrepentant racial violence of police, because that is what they were constructed and meant to do. It shows up in the way that I and the people I'm in community with, and the folks who help me think through how we can get to spaces of transformation where all of us can live and thrive in safety and dignity. So folks who I saw on the panelist list, like Elena Ball, who's at Hastings, or Andrea Luqueta, or Jasmine Sankofa, or Beth Rebay, or Erica Wilson, or Julius Nam, and also Tony Tolbert, who, shout out to you, who's retiring, and the folks on this call. So it shows up everywhere, and it gives me a methodology for the work that I do and a moral compass for the way that I live. I guess I can't overstate the importance of critical race theory to the way that I think about my own work, the possibilities for our communities, and the motivation to keep standing and fighting in the face of what are, again, seemingly intractable problems of white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and all the other systems of domination. So I'm grateful for the space.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. I'm so glad that an audio was working now, because we were really grateful to hear your voice. And last, I will hand it over to Jason.
Thank you. And I'm really grateful to Priscilla because she sums it all up, and I echo everything she said. She makes this easy for me to just build off of. I just want to echo a couple points that have been made already. So one is that the work of doing liberation has to be in relationship to and grounded in the communities that are directly impacted. And I often hear from lawyers or people who work for legal organization, well, what is our role? And I think part of that means decentering the role of the lawyer in this like broader story. And so it's also examining what is our relationship, not only as individuals, but as organizations in relationship to other organizations that are doing grassroots organizing, and with actual communities that are directly impacted. So this is not just about smart people who are lawyers coming up with ideas and thinking that they're going to implement them, but that the product of any social change is the result of the work of social movements and mass mobilization. And so we have to understand that the work that we're trying to do is one piece of a broader movement for collective liberation. I also want to say that in terms of lawyering, I think oftentimes lawyers play a negative role sometimes because, and part of that is the role that is how we've been conditioned as lawyers, that part of our job is to minimize liability, to assess risk, and to work within a particular framework and using certain legal tools. And so a lot of times I hear lawyers saying, no, we can't do X, Y, Z. These are all the reasons why that wouldn't be legal or why a court would not support this particular demand or would overturn a particular policy. And I think that for lawyers, we have to understand, again, that we're just one piece of a broader movement. And our role is not just to tell movements and organizers what's not possible, but to amplify and support the demands around liberation, right? And so what is liberation? I think that these are not new questions, and these are not necessarily new visions or articulations of what we need. We've never realized liberation in this country for Black and Indigenous people. We've never dismantled systemic racism. And so a lot of the same demands are the same demands around redistribution, right? And so I think that the conversation that we're having now around abolition and around reparations are central in how we think about what liberation is. And so to the point of my co-panelists, a lot of the reform projects are not using a reparations or an abolition framework, right? It's nibbling around the edges of what we think is possible. So when we're talking about policing, the response oftentimes is, well, you need more trainings or body cameras or some other tweaking of the system that doesn't actually get at the heart of the problem, right? Which abolition is not only about what we're against, which is policing as a racist and violent institution, but it's also about what we're for. It's about investing in housing, education, healthcare, and all of the things that actually create safe communities. It's about addressing the root causes of the inequality that we see. So we're addressing it before the issue is the issue that people are saying we need police to be utilized as a response towards. And so to kind of just also tie some of these questions into a housing context, what does reparations look like? What does abolition look like in the context of housing? What does rebellious lawyering look like? I think, part of that is in somewhat of a shorter term context, it's about canceling rent, right? Fundamentally, it's about canceling rent, not about how do we create pots of money to pay landlords to subsidize developers and line their pockets and ensure that they're getting the profits that they feel entitled to, but how do we actually fundamentally shift power and resources into communities? How do we fundamentally shift how we understand what housing is? And so it's about investing in public housing, it's investing in community control of land and housing, so that's cooperatives, community land trusts. And then for lawyers, I think, we play an important role in doing eviction defense work in the context of direct legal services. But what if we imagine the role of lawyers in representing tenants who are conducting an eviction blockade, who are representing people who are underhoused or homeless, who are reclaiming vacant homes and land, right? Like what we've seen in Oakland with the Black mothers who reclaimed the home, and I believe they've formed a community land trust from that organizing. And I think there's also historical moments that we can look to around outside of what the law provided or outside of what the state provided, although there obviously is an important role for the state in terms of shaping policy. But I think about the work of Silvia Rivera, a trans Latina activist who created Star House and was housing sex workers and trans women of color and providing housing at a time when, and that continues to be a time that oftentimes does not provide, our systems do not provide for housing and safety. And that work carries on in organizations like GLITZ, which is a nonprofit that formed in New York that's run by Kyan Dorashow, which is, again, it's Black trans women who are providing for their communities because the state doesn't. And so I also think about mutual aid during this time that, we often look towards the state for the solutions, but part of the problem is sometimes that the state is being utilized in a way to reproduce violence and trauma, as opposed to empowering and directing resources into communities where we know what to do with those resources to keep our community safe and provide opportunities. And so the last point that I want to make is around shifting our imagination of what is possible, because I think that that is something that CRT does. And I think that is part of the movement around abolition and the movement around reparations. And so we're having conversations around defunding the police in ways that I didn't think was imaginable even a year or 2 years ago. And so I think we have to continue to just build off of this work. And there's no, magic solution. There's no waving of the wand, but that this work is something that is a continuous struggle. As Angela Davis writes about, freedom is a constant struggle. And so I think we have to center that lesson in the work that we do, because oftentimes it can feel overwhelming, but this is a struggle. This is a long-term struggle, and it's something that we have to continuously commit to.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. So I know that we don't have too much time, and there's some fantastic questions in the Q&A that unfortunately we can't get to right now, but I'm going to end with just one question that we received from one of the attendees that I think is a good one for us to end on. And I'll also answer it at the end as it leads into some of my concluding remarks as well. So I would like to ask you each, how do you stay committed and energized, feel empowered to continue to fight for changes with the recognition that these systems are so corrupted? And I'll add, where are you finding joy, hope, and inspiration right now? Maybe we will start with Priscilla. And I'm so sorry that we'll only be able to have like about a minute each. So if you want to just briefly share with us.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll first say it's not always easy. We do get despondent, we do get depressed and anxious and frustrated and feeling like things are futile. So I think we need to be clear about that. Often we think that folks just have boundless energy and optimism. But it's a practice. And I think James Baldwin said, as much as I'm prone to pessimism, James Baldwin said, that the fact that I'm alive means that I do have to be optimistic, that I do have to hope. He didn't say this, I'm adding it. So that means that we also have to, strive and hope for a better tomorrow. And I know that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors and my forebears who fought for a way for me. And I know that that's the obligation that I have. Some of the work is big, like we have these moments where there's an opening and the work, the small things that we've done give way to these big moments that we have to take advantage of. And so that's where the hope it comes from. And the joy for me comes from being in community with folks who are in that mutual struggle. But I also love karaoke. I also love non-essential activities that we can't do right now because of the pandemic. Brunch, rest, the Korean day spas, which are also closed, I'm so sad about. But also taking care of ourselves and knowing that too, as Audre Lorde said, is an act of resistance. Taking up space and knowing that when we fight, we win. And we not only change systems, we change ourselves, and we honor our own human dignity and divinity when we do so. So that's where it comes from for me.
Thanks. To Jason?
Yeah, I echo what Priscilla said. Rest, the work is collective. So I think that when we understand that the work is collective, that it takes some of the pressure off of how overwhelming it can feel in terms of the burden that we think we're carrying, that you're not doing it alone. You're not the first ones to do it, and the work continues. And so it's grounded in community and resting. And I think just ask for what you need. I think a lot of times people don't ask for what they need. So if you need support, ask for it.
Thanks. Kelly?
Yeah, I think one of the practices we've embraced at the First 72 on a daily basis is to, from a client-centered perspective, really celebrate every victory, no matter how big or small. Whether we have clients who have been fighting for 6 months just to get, you know, their state identification card, or to and then things as big as 6 months of sobriety for someone who's been opiate dependent for several decades, or the courage for someone to stand up in front of a judge and just speak their truth, even when the judge shoots them back down and won't dismiss the charges and won't give them a break. But we practice every single day to bring those victories up and to celebrate them with our clients and to celebrate them as a team. And then when we get confronted with tragedy, which we often do, and we certainly have over the last 4 months, one of the things that I love and value so much in New Orleans, although it's really tragic how much death is a part of our everyday life, that there's an entire culture and celebration and, you know, practice around it. But there's a real purpose for that, and taking the time to grieve and to honor the folks that we've lost, and they become like an ever-present part of our universe and our community, whether it's just a coffee cup with their face on it or a t-shirt. But we really try to take the time to feel it, and I think that's what sustains us. And then also too, really rejecting this perspective of martyrdom, and just having to work yourself to death to be in the work. It's arrogant, and it's also short-sighted, considering, as Priscilla brought up, you know, we have the privilege to continue this work because so many people before us made it possible. And I think that's what allows us to rest then, and not and give ourselves a break.
And Kristen?
My co-panelist did such a great job kind of delineating all the things that I'd want to say, so I'll keep this brief. I think that, first of all, I'm exhausted, so I'll just say that right here. But I do think that when I think of standing on the shoulders of folks who came before, that's really, for me, that's a really big piece of how I find strength in those moments, and also allowing myself to like sit in those weak moments and take a minute, right? Take several minutes, take a few days. And, you know, whether that means, you know what, taking the vacation days that I've earned and just sitting and doing nothing, that's fine, because I realize I'm of no use to the cause or the causes or my clients, or even to myself and the people that I care about, who I'm most intimate with, if I am just like walking around with no energy, no drive, because I'm just completely exhausted emotionally, physically, mentally, in all the ways. So self-care is not just a cliche. It should be incorporated into your critical race studies and action. That's really important, because in many ways, the world, what we know historically and even now, many factions of the world don't care about us. And that may sound harsh. So we got to care about ourselves enough to take time to do self-care, and as Jason said, kind of rely on each other, right? And find times to like give each other space, but also know when to kind of step in and say, all right, I'm here for you, and let's do this collectively. So I'll end with that. And I will say that some colleagues and I, when we're really going through it and we realize we can take a pause, our favorite line is "not like this." Our ancestors didn't do all that they did with way less resources, way less access to the things and places that we have access to, for us to go out like this. So in those moments, I take a half day or a couple days, or like block off my calendar, no calls, because not like this. There's still so much work ahead, and we've got to take a minute to just catch ourselves. And there's no need to be a martyr. Plenty of work to go around, and we're a larger community than we had been many years ago. So in that, and rely on my colleagues here to push us forward.
Thank you so much for that. So I really want to just thank our panelists again for being with us here today, especially during this time when the strains of the pandemic and the strains of dismantling racism are leaving us depleted in terms of both time and energy. But I so appreciate them and all of you for joining us today in the conversation. Because racial and social justice is not a solitary practice. By its very nature, it demands a community. And so that would be my answer to this question, is that community is what keeps me going. And that's why building community is such an integral part of our program as well. In fact, the founder of critical race theory, Derek Bell, once wrote, "However self-sufficient we may fancy ourselves, we exist only in relation to our friend, family, and life partners, to those we teach and mentor, to our coworkers and neighbors, strangers, and even to forces we cannot fully conceive of, let alone define. In many ways, we are our relationships. And we are stronger, wiser, and more steadfast in our commitment to social justice for having these relationships. The work we do can often be difficult and frustrating. We must contest dominant narratives and discourse that have been so institutionalized that they're taken as absolute truth. The case law is often against us, and we lack the money and the resources of the other side. But it is precisely because of these difficulties that this work demands a community. We are more effective advocates when we can have the support and the collaboration of other smart, passionate, strategic allies. And we can work to find these systems of support, but what we're trying to do here at CRS is to institutionalize this space, which can foster and give a home to this community. It's a space in which we can train ourselves to be better scholars and advocates, utilizing the law for social change, while at the same time acknowledging that the legal framework under which we operate has grown out of and perpetuates a system that has been and is deeply, traumatically, and perversely racial and racist. So again, I just want to thank you all for joining us here today. We will send a follow-up email tomorrow with some readings and resources, as well as ways in which all of you can also become more involved in the critical race studies community and support the work that we do. So thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And one last time, I will put it on gallery view, and we can just applaud everyone. So thank you, and I will then end.